Hello and welcome. Is the United Nations and international community covering up a potentially fraudulent election in Afghanistan? Well, that question has become central in a debate over the validity of the voting that took place on the 20th of August. And the controversy has led to the firing of the American diplomat who held the #2 post in the UN mission in Afghanistan for saying just that. Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who until last week served as deputy UN envoy to Afghanistan, says the organization failed to prevent fraud in the election and then failed to investigate the charges of fraud afterwards. He's joining us today from Bergen in Norway. Ambassador Galbraith's allegations have split the UN mission in Kabul down the middle and raised questions about the international community's agenda in Afghanistan. The final results of the election have not been announced yet, although the incumbent President Hamid Karzai currently leads with 54.5% of the vote, enough to escape a runoff election. On Monday, the Independent Election Commission began auditing 358 suspicious ballot boxes, and the Electoral Complaints Commission is still reviewing other complaints. So today we ask, is the UN involved in a cover-up in Afghanistan? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part. And we'll also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Ambassador Galbraith, good to have you with us. And I guess it's the obvious opening question. Was the election in Afghanistan a fraud then?
It was characterized by massive fraud. In the southern provinces, multiples of votes were recorded as compared to the numbers of voters who actually cast them. In some cases, 4 times as many votes were tabulated as voters went to the polls. If you look at what the Afghan Independent Election Commission, which incidentally is not truly independent, it's a pro-Karzai body. If you look at the criteria that they adopted and then abandoned, but by their initial criteria, up to 30% of the Karzai votes would be quarantined and suspicious.
So, Ambassador, then, is the United Nations actually covering up this fraudulency? If it's this fraud, if it's on the scale that you say, what would it also stand to get out of such a cover-up?
Well, let me be clear. The United Nations, meaning the professionals who worked at the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, did everything that we could to prevent the fraud, to document it when it took place, to make that documentation available to the Independent Election Commission and then to the UN-backed Election Complaints Commission. The head of the United Nations mission thwarted our efforts at every stage. Probably the most critical point was before the elections. In July, I became aware that the greatest risk of fraud was going to come from polling stations which existed on a map, but which were in locations that were so insecure, either or in fact even controlled by the Taliban, that they were never going to open. So these were polling centers that no Afghan official, nobody from the Army, the police, or the Independent Election Commission had ever visited, and which were not possible to be visited on election day by candidate agents, by observers, or even by voters. And so obviously that made it quite easy, if those remained on the books, for election staff to take the materials, pretend that they'd held a vote, and then return them, perhaps not even with, perhaps just the results without ballots to match, or maybe having stuffed the ballot boxes. I tried to get the Afghan Election Commission and the ministers to remove these from the books. Naturally, the ministers complained. Of course, they were representing President Karzai, who was a beneficiary of the fraud, and the head of the UN mission then ordered me not to do anything further.
Well, Ambassador, if Ambassador Qaidi,
and of course, I
was going to say, if he actually was rejecting your concerns, it then went up higher to the United Nations Secretary General, who actually fired you. In your opinion, how high is this lack of response going?
Well, I certainly thought it was very strange for the Secretary General of the United Nations to fire the senior official who was responsible for providing support to the Afghan institutions for these elections, because he was concerned about fraud in elections that were paid for by the international community and supported by the United Nations itself. That was a strange result, and it was particularly strange to do it at this time because I was publicly identified as having been concerned about fraud, and of course, what did one expect the Afghan opposition to think when the man who they see as concerned about the fraud is fired?
Let me ask you to respond to the quote that came from Ambassador Qaidi, the US envoy that we're referring to here. On the 21st of September, he said, "I call on the IEC and the ECC, that's the Independent Election Commission and the Electoral Complaints Commission, to ensure a timely conclusion to this process while respecting international standards and the need for transparency. The final result of this election must reflect the will of the Afghan people." Judging by that statement, it seems that you both want to achieve the same thing. What do you expect to happen at this stage if it rests with the Electoral Complaints Commission to decide whether or not there was significant fraud?
Well, those were fine words, and of course I agree entirely with the words, but the problem is in the period from July through to mid-September, those words were matched by no action, and in fact were matched by instructions not to do anything and by systematic denial, first that fraud had taken place and then a downplaying of it. But at this stage, the process needs to go forward. Hopefully the Election Complaints Commission will come up with a credible outcome that can be accepted by all Afghans. The difficulty is that when you commit fraud, you have, when fraud is allowed to take place, you really have the advantage. The Election Complaints Commission has to root out, find the fraudulent ballots, and then eliminate them from the count. And it's going to be very tough for them to do that with 100% of the ballots. If they can get 50%, they would be doing a very good job. But that would, of course, mean that 50% fraudulent ballots were still in the count.
We've got a caller on the line from Maryland here in the USA. Ibrahim has a question or a comment. Ibrahim, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is like United States right now in the middle of the situation in Afghanistan, like the corruption government in Afghanistan, also the election is not good. How can deal with this all problem if United States continue the same government support like the corruption? If this is not right, how can we change this one?
Okay, I mean, that's actually a valid question. What can be done to correct this, even if there is some degree of recognizing there's been huge fraud in the election? The way things have become, or seem to have become, entrenched, it's going to be very difficult to come up with an alternative to what's happened, isn't it? Well,
one possibility is that the Election Complaints Commission will uncover enough of the fraudulent ballots and eliminate them from the count so that there'll be a runoff. That is, President Karzai would end up below 50%. You would have a runoff. And that might be one way to move beyond this. But of course, it will be then important that the problems that occurred in the initial round on the 20th of August are not repeated in the runoff. And two things need to happen there. First, the polling centers where the fraud took place, and these were mostly ghost polling centers, that is ones that never opened, they have to be eliminated from the books. And secondly, the election commission staff who perpetrated the fraud or collaborated with those who perpetrated the fraud have to be removed and replaced with new people who will do a more honest job.
Go ahead, Nadiri, then. Let's get your question in.
Yeah, the thing is, because my question is to your guest, United NY, and that he knew from previously, because George Mitchell, when he was appointed to the UN post, and Hamid Karzai refused him, and he appointed the UNNY Qaida. And because of that, he's taking his side. Previously, he knew that. Why he didn't put these concerns to Obama or other UN top, Ban Ki-moon or somebody else?
It seems there's a very complex history to the whole appointment issue here as well, Ambassador. And I just want to get your take on the fact that we've got Richard Holbrooke, who's supposed to be, the envoy for the region. He's got his issues with Ambassador Qaidi, who's heading up the UN mission there. You've got the UN-US axis at odds here.
Well, to some degree, they're at odds. But the fact is, the United Nations had the responsibility to support under the mandate, to support the Afghan institutions in the conduct of, and I quote from the Security Council resolution, free, fair, and transparent elections, not fraudulent ones. And frankly, the United Nations, or to be precise, the head of the UN mission in Afghanistan, fell down on the job. He chose not to do anything, and that made it very difficult for the United States or anybody else in the international community to be pursuing these issues, because under the Security Council resolution, this was really the job of the United Nations. Certainly Ambassador Holbrooke did raise the issue. He was deeply concerned about it. But again, the responsibility actually rested with Qaidi as the head of the UN mission.
Ambassador, how do you regard the fact that other organizations observing the elections essentially gave it a sign-off and approval?
Hardly. The European Commission, which had the largest observer delegation, also provided its estimate that there were 1.5 million fraudulent ballots, which was, 25% of the total. The other observer missions also found huge problems. The Afghan government threatened to expel the head of the European Commission mission precisely because of its report.
Well, Ambassador, we've got to take a very short break here. More questions for you in a moment. We'll be taking an instant poll in our chat room during the break, and today we ask, how credible was Afghanistan's election? You can vote and join the conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com and enter the chat room where the debate's taking place right now. We'll be back in just a moment.